August 1914. Canada joined Britain and marched off to war against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was the Great War. The Canadian public received reports from the front lines, but few knew of the fight for freedom in their own country. This is the story of people interned between the peaks.
July 13th, 1915. To Major Duncan Stewart, Officer Commanding Internment Operations, Castle, Alberta. The superintendent advised me that he had shipped a number of new tents and agreed to furnish me with 2 large tents, one for stores and one for a mess tent. The following day we received barbed wire and staples for the prisoners' enclosure. According to your instructions, I have laid this out carefully, measuring it, and when complete, it will be 120 feet by 240 feet. The post will be sunk 4.5 feet in the ground, and there will be 20 strands of wire 6 inches apart, making a total of 10 feet above the ground. Work will be proceeded with this, so as the medical officer and yourself have approved the exact location. I have the honor to be your obedient servant, O.L. Spencer, Captain.
From the period of 1891, when the first 2 settlers, Vasily Lenik and Ivan Pipiliu, were the first recognized Ukrainians coming to Canada, up to 1914, that totaled in, I think, about 200,000 people. A lot of people settled on land. The cost of $10 was the registration fee, and it allowed them 160 acres, which is unrealized availability of land, where they were actually forced to live on probably only about 2 to 3 acres and try to sustain life on that in the old country. When war was declared, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was at war with France and England. The Canadians were to take up arms. They weren't too sure about the Eastern European ethnic groups, and under the Internment Act started to gather the single men agitators of sorts and put them into internment camps. I understand that the total number that were registered as a requirement by the Canadian government was 86,000, and the internments encompassed about 8,500. 660 people were interned in the Castle Mountain camp. It was a camp that they didn't know what to do with the men, so they made work projects for them. I guess they felt strongly that this was necessary, and not knowing the actual reason for it, they took the action of interning them.
July 23rd, 1915. I have the honor to report that, as you are aware, 60 prisoners of war arrived on the 14th, and 60 more on the 16th, and 71 on the 19th, making 191 in all. The idea of the Department of Interior is to cut down all dead trees, and so many of the living ones within 300 to 400 feet of the railway line as is necessary to give the valley an open, park-like appearance. They are also to cut and clear a motor road, and when so engaged, will also be strung out to a very considerable distance in the wood.
My grandfather came from a village named Kiseliv in the province of Bukovina, western Ukraine, which at that time was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He came to Canada by a slow boat, as I recall him relating the trip, landed in Halifax, where he was totally broke, and for the first 2 weeks worked loading some vessels. Wherever there was a job, that's where he would settle. And so for the years that they spent in Canada, the four brothers, they roamed all over Canada and even United States. They were of military service age, and the Canadian authorities seemed to have at that time decided that this is the type that should be interned, because they had the least of family connections here in Canada. Their experience in the camps were varied because they were not in the same camp. They were kidding each other. They thought that they looked a lot better now that their wives were feeding them regularly, and there was no way that they could sit and count their ribs the way they used to be able to do in the camps, where the food was poor and they were forever hungry. And they were skinny and in rough shape. But they didn't seem to really have any bitterness about this, except that they had decided that they were not welcome in Canada. They were not the type of people that Canadians would want to settle, so they all made it back and decided to stay in their home country.
April 22nd, 1916. Weather warm, 40 degrees above. 340 prisoners of war sent out on park work today. Lieutenant Hay, who was in command of the camp this day, had fire drill for the troops and prisoners of war at 2:30 p.m. All the prisoners were turned out of the compound, and after the practice, allowed to return.
You were telling me that your dad was not willing to talk about the camp very much.
No, he didn't reveal too much to us as when we were children. But
I wonder if that contributed to the fact that it was a forgotten site for so long.
like you were saying, this is the line for the fence, probably, for the
That's the avenue for the military camp.
military camp.
It's sort of separated. It separated the military side from the enclosure.
Mm-hmm.
And the military side is very obvious because of the stone markings, which are all still here. Although the cairns are flattened, they're still very obvious as well.
Mm-hmm.
The enclosure is kind of invisible now. This line here, marked by the stones, is probably the dividing line of the camp. It's the west side of the avenue, and on this side, the enclosure was built. You can actually follow it all the way up and find the entrance gate to the enclosure. They would bring it in as in a little pathway, both sides.
My father was here, and it must have been a little bad for him to think that, you know, he'd been in this country 8 years prior to 1914, then to be put into the camp. And it brings back, it must bring back memories, I know it does to our family, that our dad was interned in here.
If you can come on a day like today, a somber day, and you suddenly come across the barbed wire, you really realize what this place was all about. It was an internment place. It was a prison. There are pits, latrine pits, washhouse pits, cookhouse pits. They still exist. There's a fireplace pit well off into the sort of southeast corner. And you can go around the site, and every once in a while you'll find a large tree now with a piece of barbed wire or page wire running right through the middle of it. It's quite a novelty. There are remnants over in the creek of the bridge that took the soldiers and the prisoners both out of the camp and into the camp from the railway track.
The barbed wire itself is enough to scare you, and it must have been rough here because of the conditions, and then taken out of here into Banff.
Without the barbed wire, this is one of the most beautiful spots in the park, with one of the most distinctive mountains in the Rockies. There was no road, no highway that went through here. The prisoners that came here built the road or at least a major extension of the road from Banff as part of the park infrastructure.
They were doing that, and they also worked, they helped on the golf course in Banff, and they built a bridge. They also did some work on the Lake Minnewanka Road. But basically, they were building this road out here, what we call the Bow Valley Parkway now. And that was basically their function out here.
January 5th, 1916. The prisoners of war cooks complained about frozen meat. This complaint was inquired into and found to be unavoidable during the cold spell. Steps are being taken to construct a kitchen for the prisoners of war where they can thaw out their meat.
My father came from Ukraine before World War I on a freighter ship where he actually worked his way over, so he paid for his ticket by doing the work on the freighter ship. He came to Eastern Canada. From there he went by rail through to Calgary because he had a brother and a sister living here in Calgary. They needed people in Canada, and they made it sound real rosy, like it was a wonderful place to be. And of course, when he got here, he found that life was hard as it was in Ukraine. It was in July that he was taken into the camp. At that time, he had just turned 19, so he was just a young man. He wasn't a large man. He was small in stature. And he was willing to go along with the way things were. And he was working for the CN Rail. And he would tell us of how he was actually working on the railroad when the RCMP came, walked over to him and said, "Are you John Harlock?" And yes. And he says, "Well, come with us." And they wouldn't even let him go and pick up his coat and his bag of whatever he had with him. And they took him in and actually locked him up. And then shortly after that, they transported him to the Castle Mountain intern camp. He did some work on the road from Banff going up to the Upper Hot Springs. I guess they were clearing the road there and working in that area. So they kept the men busy even in the winter to some extent. And he said they had a great big stove in the middle of the tent. And they would just keep this thing stoked up till it was just about red hot to keep warm. So they just burnt the wood that they cut. And then he kind of explained that when the weather got really, really bad, and they felt they couldn't keep the tent city, I guess you could call it, going, they did transport them into the Cave and Basin area where they actually had some buildings. I remember Dad telling about peeling potatoes and peeling onions and help preparing the food. I guess it was really difficult to keep their food fresh and keep it from spoiling. But he would tell about when he would serve the butter, and he'd open up these wrapped up butter and he would see little worms in the butter. And he says he would pick up a little stick and he'd push these little worms down into the butter and then smooth it off on the top so that the men wouldn't see these little maggots in there when they ate it, because it wouldn't be so bad if they didn't know it was there. So I guess the situation wasn't that good. But yet on the other hand, I've often thought about this. You feel sorry for these men and what they went through. But on the other hand, there was a war. And had he stayed back in the old country and in Ukraine, I'm sure at his age he would have been on the front lines and fighting the war.
Today, few are aware of this unmarked site. Even fewer know of the contribution made to our parks and our country by the men interned here. Their stories survive in the memories of their children, waiting for history to acknowledge the plight of the internees who were caught between the peaks. Saturday, July 14th, 1917. Warm.
Temperature 84 degrees. No prisoners of war on park work. Arrived today for closing of camp were Major Loggy, Captain Hitchie, Lieutenant Hitchie.